One minute, they were heroes heading toward the stars. The literally next minute, their spaceship exploded and everyone on board was gone. In just 73 seconds, America's space dream turned into a national nightmare. And the scary thing is that the whole world watched it unfold live. There's something deeply powerful about the memory of Challenger. For those old enough to remember it, the event is seared into their minds with astonishing clarity. Like JFK's assassination, or 9/11, everyone remembers where they were when it happened. But what caused it? And how did it all end so badly? It was a bright and bitterly cold Tuesday morning, January 28, 1986, when millions of eyes turned to the skies. In schools, homes, offices and bars, Americans gathered around televisions and radios to witness what was supposed to be a landmark moment in space history. This wasn't just another space shuttle launch. This was different. This was emotional. For the first time ever, a civilian, a teacher, was going into space. Krista McAuliffe, a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, was set to become the first private citizen in orbit. Her mission wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. She was going to deliver lessons from space, an inspiration for children across the globe. In her words, "I touch the future. I teach." NASA had pitched this flight as a beacon of hope, a chance to connect the average American with the wonders of the cosmos. The shuttle itself was called Challenger, a name that already carried a sense of bravery, ambition, and defiance. This was STS-51L, the 25th shuttle mission in NASA's growing program. And it was supposed to be routine. But 73 seconds after liftoff, it became anything but that. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifted off from Launch Pad 39B at the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida. Its white solid rocket boosters ignited, propelling it into a clear blue sky. The launch seemed smooth and cheers erupted across the nation. But by 11:39 a.m., those cheers turned into gasps, shock, and disbelief.
Downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
So the 25th Space Shuttle mission is now on the way after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning it looked as though they were not going to be able to get off.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
On live television, the shuttle appeared to disintegrate in midair, leaving behind a massive, Y-shaped trail of smoke. Newscasters stuttered. Teachers froze in front of classroom TVs. Families fell silent. What had just happened? At first, the public didn't fully grasp what they had seen. Had it veered off course? Was it part of the mission? A malfunction? Then confirmation. Challenger was gone. The orbiter had broken apart just over a minute into its ascent, and all 7 crew members were presumed dead. You need to understand, this wasn't just a regular mission crew. These were people who had become household names in the weeks leading up to the launch. Francis R. Scobie, mission commander, was a seasoned pilot with a warm smile and decades of experience. Michael J. Smith, the pilot, was known for his calm under pressure. Judith A. Resnick, a talented engineer and the second American woman in space at that time. Ronald McNair, a physicist, a black belt in karate, and one of the first African Americans in space. Ellison Onizuka, an Air Force colonel and the first Asian American astronaut. Gregory Jarvis, payload specialist and aerospace engineer. And of course, Krista McAuliffe, the teacher turned astronaut, symbol of the mission's idealism. These weren't just astronauts, they were symbols, the dream team, emblems of a more inclusive, more accessible space program. And now, they were gone. President Ronald Reagan was scheduled to deliver his annual State of the Union address that evening. Instead, he postponed it and spoke directly to the nation for 4 minutes in one of the most memorable presidential speeches of the 20th century.
We took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. We mourn their loss as a nation together. The families of the 7, we cannot bear as you do the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave.
The Challenger disaster wasn't just a failed mission, it was a collective trauma. It was the first real-time televised catastrophe in American history. Never before had death arrived with such speed, such clarity, and such emotional weight to an audience that large. It changed everything. To truly understand the Challenger disaster, not just as an event, but as a deeply symbolic rupture in America's relationship with space, we need to rewind the clock. Not to the morning of January 28, 1986, but to the months leading up to it. Because disasters like this never happen in isolation. They are not singular moments. They are built layer by layer, decision by decision, compromise by compromise. The Challenger disaster, if anything, was a slow-motion tragedy. The final 73 seconds were simply the crescendo of a song that had already been written. You see, in the decades following the moon landing in 1969, NASA had become more than just a government agency. It was a symbol of possibility. America's space program represented everything bold, brave, and futuristic. It was the crown jewel of Cold War competition. It was science fiction made real. But by the 1980s, the space race was over. Budgets were shrinking, public interest was fading, and NASA needed a win. That win would come in the form of the Space Shuttle program, a revolutionary idea that aimed to make space travel routine. Instead of disposable rockets, NASA introduced reusable orbiters. Shuttles could take off like rockets, orbit the Earth, and then land like airplanes. It was marketed as space travel for the modern age. By the time Challenger rolled around in 1986, NASA had already completed 24 shuttle missions, but they needed more positive press. Enter Krista McAuliffe. The Challenger mission wasn't just another shuttle flight, it was a public relations masterstroke. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan announced the Teacher in Space project, a bold initiative designed to rekindle American interest in space exploration by selecting an ordinary school teacher to join a shuttle crew. The message was clear: space isn't just for scientists, space is for everyone. From a pool of over 11,000 applicants, one woman stood out: Sharon Krista McAuliffe, a 37-year-old social studies teacher from New Hampshire, with a warm smile, natural charisma, and a love for teaching.
Challenger, Houston, we have good TV. Go ahead with the lesson, Krista.
Okay. Good morning. This is Krista McAuliffe, live from the Challenger, and I'm going to be taking you through a field trip.
She wasn't just a passenger, she had a mission: to teach 2 15-minute lessons from orbit, one on the history of space, the other on what it's like to live and work in space. The lessons would be beamed back to classrooms around the country. Even hearing it right now, I too would be excited. It was groundbreaking, and the bet to include a teacher for the space travel paid off hugely. Krista McAuliffe became a media darling. She appeared on the Today Show, gave interviews, and was featured in countless newspaper articles. She wasn't just going to space, she was taking the country with her. But Krista McAuliffe wasn't the only talented personnel on board. The Challenger crew of STS-51L was a tapestry of talent and diversity. Francis R. Scobie, the commander, was a seasoned Air Force pilot who had flown in the Vietnam War and served as a test pilot. He was calm, confident, and deeply respected. Michael J. Smith, the pilot, was on his first space mission, a Navy veteran known for his attention to detail. Ronald McNair, a physicist and accomplished saxophonist, was one of the first African Americans in space. Judith A. Resnick, an electrical engineer, had already made history as the second American woman in space. She was intensely focused and deeply intelligent. Ellison Onizuka, the first Asian-American astronaut, brought a quiet resolve and deep commitment. Gregory Jarvis, a payload specialist working with Hughes Aircraft, was a civilian like Krista and had been bumped from 2 previous missions. Together they formed a crew that symbolized not just scientific achievement, but America's diversity and optimism. On paper, nothing should have gone wrong, but in reality, it went terribly wrong. On January 28, 1986, the crew suited up in their blue NASA flight suits and orange launch entry suits. They smiled for the cameras, hugged their families, climbed into the shuttle. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown reached 0. T-3, 2, 1. Ignition. Challenger roared to life. Flames erupted from the base. The shuttle cleared the tower. For 73 seconds, everything appeared normal. Then, it happened. A plume of black smoke, a flash of flame, and then the fireball. The shuttle didn't technically explode. The external fuel tank ruptured, releasing superheated liquid oxygen and hydrogen that ignited into a massive fire cloud. The orbiter was torn apart by aerodynamic forces. The crew cabin remained intact, continuing along a ballistic arc before smashing into the Atlantic Ocean at 200 miles per hour. NASA initially claimed the astronauts died instantly, but that wasn't true. You see, months later, after a full investigation, the world would learn something far more horrifying. The crew likely survived the breakup. There was evidence that personal emergency oxygen packs had been activated, switches had been moved, lights had been adjusted inside the cabin. They had lived. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, the crew fell toward the ocean, possibly conscious, possibly aware of the impending death. But there were no parachutes, no eject mechanisms, no escape, nothing at all. At impact with the ocean, the cabin disintegrated. It's a moment almost too brutal to imagine, one that transformed the tragedy from a sudden loss to a slow-motion nightmare. The whole nation went into mourning immediately. It was too catastrophic. But even in the grief, whispers began. At first, the narrative was simple. A tragic accident, an unforeseen event, a heartbreaking technical malfunction. But over time, cracks began to form in that narrative. Not everyone bought the official story. Some noticed the speed with which NASA clamped down on footage, sealed records, or restricted access to the investigation. Others couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Not in the visuals, not in the timeline, not in the behaviour of officials. And in the years to follow, conspiracy theorists would enter the picture. Online forums, books, and underground documentaries, and they would all echo the same haunting question. Was the Challenger disaster really an accident? Or was it something else entirely? In the days after the Challenger disaster, the grief was thick. The airwaves were saturated with solemn music, memorial services, and reruns of the launch gone wrong. It was a time of national mourning, raw, sacred, and heavy. But once the shock wore off, and the cameras stopped rolling and the tears were all out, something else emerged. Doubt. Because while most of the country was grieving, a few were paying closer attention. And the closer they looked, the more things didn't seem to add up. It started quietly. A question here, a whisper there, a thread on a conspiracy forum, a peculiar facial similarity in an academic brochure. And just like that, the Challenger disaster transformed from a tragic failure of engineering into a possible fabrication, a cover-up, or even something more sinister. To understand how these doubts formed, we need to look at the official story and where it began to fray. NASA's narrative was fairly straightforward. Due to O-ring failure caused by cold temperatures, one of the solid rocket boosters leaked hot gas onto the external fuel tank. The tank ruptured, the orbiter broke apart, and the crew died instantly in the explosion. Case closed. But as more documents were declassified and the Rogers Commission began its investigation, disturbing truths began to leak out. Truths that undermined the instant death claim and introduced possibilities far more unsettling. First, the explosion itself. NASA had originally referred to it as an explosion, but aerospace engineers would later clarify that what the public saw wasn't technically an explosion of the orbiter. It was a structural breakup. The external tank disintegrated under pressure, not from an ignition of the shuttle's main engines or boosters. The crew cabin, the forward section of the shuttle where the astronauts sat, was still intact as it arced through the sky. It remained pressurized and structurally sound for a short time. Radar tracked it. Cameras captured it. The module flew upward for several seconds, reached the peak of its arc, and then began a free fall toward the Atlantic Ocean. The most harrowing part? That fall lasted 165 seconds, nearly 3 minutes. During that time, the astronauts were likely alive, possibly conscious, possibly aware. An internal NASA memo released years later revealed that at least 3 of the personal oxygen packs had been manually activated. One was worn by pilot Michael Smith, whose body was recovered with his equipment intact. One of the astronauts was found with his hand reaching for the switch. That simple action of a hand reaching for a switch in a falling shuttle haunted investigators. It suggested a terrible reality, that the crew may have survived the initial breakup and lived just long enough to know they were falling, helplessly, to their deaths. There were no parachutes on board, no ejection seats, no chance of rescue. And yet the world was told they died instantly. Why? That question led to more. Why did NASA withhold this information? Why did they publicly maintain the instant death narrative, even when internal reports showed otherwise? Some argued it was to protect the families. Others said it was to preserve public confidence in the shuttle program. But to a lot of people, it felt like something else. A lie, one that could unravel the entire truth if pulled at the right angle. It wasn't just the circumstances of death, it was also about who knew what and when. Which leads to our second reason, and why NASA lied. In January 1986, Florida was experiencing unseasonably cold weather, a rare freeze that dropped temperatures to below freezing overnight. At Cape Canaveral, icicles formed on the shuttle's launch tower. The air was still and sharp, and frost coated the launch pad. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Inside the offices of Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, engineers were alarmed and worried. In particular, 2 names stood out: Roger Boisjoli and Alan MacDonald. They had spent months raising concerns about the O-ring seals, which are rubber components designed to prevent hot gas from escaping the joints of the solid rocket boosters. These seals were known to harden in cold weather, losing flexibility and failing to expand properly under pressure. Without working O-rings, gas from the boosters could leak out and ignite catastrophically, which is exactly what happened to the Challenger. On the evening before the launch, engineers at Morton Thiokol held an emergency teleconference with NASA officials. They warned that launching below 11 degrees Celsius was dangerous, and January 28th was expected to be even lower, down to 2 degrees Celsius at launch. Boisjoli and his colleagues implored their managers to delay, and for a moment it seemed they had succeeded. Morton Thiokol initially refused to give NASA the green light. But then, pressure mounted. NASA managers pushed back. Launch delays meant bad press, political consequences, and budget problems. The shuttle program was already behind schedule. Challenger had been delayed 5 times in just 1 week. After a closed-door discussion among executives, without the engineers present, Morton Thiokol reversed its position. The launch was approved, and the rest, as they say, was history. Roger Boisjoli, the engineer who had warned Morton Thiokol and NASA about the O-rings, was later called to testify before the Rogers Commission. He was direct, emotional, and damning. In his exact words, we all knew the O-rings would fail. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. When pressed on why the launch was approved despite multiple warnings, Boisjoli gave a chilling answer. We were pressured into reversing our recommendation. Engineers begged their superiors not to launch, but they were overruled, not because the data had changed, but because NASA needed a win. The White House wanted the launch to coincide with the State of the Union. The shuttle schedule was behind. The pressure to maintain launch quotas was overwhelming. A life or death decision had been reduced to a public relations timeline. All this was revealed in great detail in the Rogers Commission report, which was created to investigate the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. There is also a link in the description below where you can click and download the PDF version of the report for you to read at your convenience. Another red flag to people was the speed at which the aftermath was sanitized. You see, as mentioned earlier, just 1 month after the disaster, President Reagan announced the formation of the Rogers Commission, a panel led by former Secretary of State William Rogers, astronaut Neil Armstrong, physicist Richard Feynman, and other high-profile names. The commission was tasked with investigating the technical failure, but its scope was narrow. It wasn't about laying blame, it was about preserving NASA's image. In such, Feynman was so frustrated by the sanitized conclusions that he famously dropped a piece of O-ring into a glass of ice water on national TV to prove its brittleness in cold conditions. His act was a subtle rebellion against the Commission's attempt to downplay what had really happened.
I took the stuff that I got out of your seal and I put it in ice water. And I discovered that when you put some pressure on it for a while and then undo it, it maintains, it doesn't stretch back, it stays the same dimension. In other words, for a few seconds at least, and more seconds than that, there's no resilience in this particular material when it's at a temperature of 32 degrees. I believe that has some significance for...
And just like that, the narrative was sealed. But then came the strange part, even by this channel's standards. Years after the tragedy, photos began circulating online. Not of debris or crash sites, but of people. Living people. Professors, business executives, lawyers. People who looked exactly like the Challenger crew. Not kind of similar. Exactly. The resemblance was so strong that some names were identical. A Richard Scobie, CEO of a marketing firm in Chicago, looked exactly like Francis Scobie, the Challenger commander. A Judith Resnick was working as a professor of law at Yale, bearing an uncanny resemblance to the astronaut of the same name. A Michael J. Smith, engineer and pilot, was found living in Wisconsin, also matching the pilot killed in the disaster. Each of these people had biographies, addresses, and public records. Some even shared the same birthdays as the deceased astronauts. Coincidence? Some believed so, but conspiracy theorists saw something else. They believed the crew didn't die at all, that it was all staged, and they came with proof. The theory goes like this. The Challenger explosion was a staged event, designed either as a distraction, an experiment in public perception, or to hide the crew members' participation in a classified program. Instead of dying, the crew was relocated, given new identities, planted into academic or private sector roles, hidden in plain sight. The reasoning? Varied. Some claim it was part of a Cold War intelligence operation where astronauts were repurposed for secret missions. Others say it was about control, a test to see if the government could manipulate reality on a massive scale. The pattern of strange coincidences kept fueling speculation. And as the internet matured, so did the ability to cross-reference faces, names and data, turning rumour into digital folklore. Perhaps the most telling aspect was the media's silence. Mainstream outlets never investigated the identity claims. Even when online communities produced side-by-side comparisons that went viral, there was no national coverage. In such, people were hoping someone would disprove them, say they were wrong, or that they were seeing things, but no one did. No one came forward to say it's all lies. People asked, why weren't these lookalikes ever interviewed or publicly debunked? Why didn't NASA address the rumours? Why was the footage of the Challenger's fall limited and controlled? And all they got for answers was silence. And in this age of open information, this silence spoke volumes. Of course, you could say there are rational explanations for much of this. Face similarities are more common than we like to admit. Names repeat. Public records are messy. But to those who already distrust the government, who have seen other proven cover-ups, it didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like confirmation. Because whether it's Watergate, MKUltra, the Tuskegee experiment, or the NSA surveillance revelations, history has shown us time and time again, conspiracies do happen. And once a seed of doubt is planted, it doesn't take much for it to grow. The concept of a doppelganger is ancient. Across cultures and time periods, stories have emerged of doubles, ghostly lookalikes that appear as harbingers of death, or as mysterious signs from another realm. But in the case of the Challenger disaster, the word doppelganger took on an entirely different meaning. It wasn't just that someone looked similar to a dead astronaut, it was that they looked exactly the same. Same face, same age, Same building in some cases, the same name. And if the implications weren't so serious, you could almost dismiss it as a bizarre internet rabbit hole. But the people pushing this theory weren't just fringe bloggers in tinfoil hats. They were professionals, retired investigators, private citizens with backgrounds in law enforcement, forensics and facial recognition.
We remember Dick Scobie, the commander who spoke the last words we heard from the Space Shuttle Challenger. We remember Michael Smith. We remember Judith Resnick. We remember Krista McAuliffe. We remember Ellison Onizuka. We remember Ronald McNair.
The similarities were baffling, and their central claim, the Challenger astronauts never died. And I get it. I mean, if it were 2 or even 3 out of 7, we could say it's just a doppelganger or a coincidence, but 7 out of 7 is really uncanny. These were not hidden images, they were out in the open. And yet, the people in these photos bore a shocking resemblance to individuals that, according to history, should not exist anymore. One of the earliest sparks came from a photo taken at Yale Law School. There, on the faculty page, was a woman named Judith Resnick, a professor of constitutional law, highly respected, frequently published, and identical in appearance to Judith A. Resnick, the Challenger astronaut and electrical engineer who had supposedly died in 1986. The match was stunning. Same high cheekbones, same jawline, same distinctive eyebrows, same intense gaze. It was enough to ignite curiosity, which quickly turned into obsession. 1 is coincidence, but 7. Soon more matches surfaced. Francis Scobie, the Challenger commander, had a supposed lookalike named Richard Scobie, CEO of a Chicago-based marketing company. The resemblance? Uncanny. Grey hair, broad smile, same deep-set eyes. Even the voice, according to those who heard him speak, carried a similar cadence. Michael J. Smith, the shuttle's pilot, was allegedly alive and well, working as a university professor in Wisconsin. His full name, birthday, and even military background all aligned suspiciously close to the original Michael Smith. Ellison Onizuka had a supposed twin in a NASA-related firm. Online forums began cataloguing the sightings, like UFO enthusiasts mapping crop circles. Side-by-side photo comparisons went viral. Before and after Challenger collages were shared across conspiracy pages, Reddit, and even YouTube videos, amassing millions of views. The pattern was clear. These weren't lookalikes, these were reappearances, leading to questions like, what if the crew never boarded the shuttle at all? What if the explosion wasn't just a tragic accident, but a planned event, staged to look like a disaster, while allowing 7 individuals to disappear from public life and re-emerge elsewhere under carefully curated identities? It sounds outrageous. But then again, so did the idea of the CIA using LSD to control minds until documents proved it. So did the idea that the NSA was spying on millions of Americans, until Edward Snowden made it undeniable. To believers, the Challenger deception followed a similar playbook. Distract, manipulate, and control the narrative. And most importantly, make the truth disappear. So sure, we have MKUltra and the NSA scandal, but why stage a tragedy? What did NASA or the government hope to get? Easy. Money. Some say it was about funding. NASA's budget had been shrinking throughout the 1980s. By staging a high-profile tragedy, one that included a beloved schoolteacher and a diverse, inspiring crew, the agency could spark a new wave of public sympathy and political support. And it worked. In the wake of the Challenger disaster, the US government poured billions into NASA for redesign, safety improvements, and the construction of a new shuttle known as the Endeavour. Others believe it was about covering up a deeper secret, that the shuttle wasn't going to deploy satellites or perform science missions as claimed, but was instead part of a classified military operation. A test, a weapon system, an orbital experiment gone wrong. If the mission failed, the cover story was already built in, a national tragedy. And what about the crew? Why would they agree to disappear? That's where the theory drifts into the darkest territory. Some claim they were coerced, that their families were promised pensions and protection, that their new lives were chosen for them, not by them. Others say they volunteered, true believers in a mission far above public understanding. Once again, this sounds like an excuse until you see that the United States government has done things like this. They've coerced people into doing things they didn't want to do. I mean, the greatest boxer that ever lived, Muhammad Ali, was almost thrown into jail because he refused to the government bidding of joining the army. Not because he was scared, but because he refused fighting a war that didn't make sense in the first place. So yes, it was possible that these 7 people were threatened or coerced into playing along. Perhaps what makes the Challenger conspiracy so potent is not just the eerie evidence or the odd coincidences, it's the emotional betrayal it implies. The idea that a national tragedy, grieved by millions, could have been staged? That kind of lie doesn't just erode trust in institutions, it shatters it. If NASA, the government and the media could all collude to fake something as huge as this, what else could they be hiding? And perhaps more unsettling, why wouldn't they do it again? That's why the Challenger theory continues to echo decades later. Because even if the specifics are wrong, even if every lookalike has a plausible explanation, it taps into something primal. The fear that reality itself is not what it seems. In the immediate aftermath of the Challenger explosion, the nation looked to 2 places for answers: NASA, the agency responsible for the launch, and the media, the fourth estate meant to hold institutions accountable. And for a time it seemed like both were doing their jobs. But as weeks turned into months, and months turned into decades, a troubling pattern emerged, one that conspiracy theorists would point to as evidence of deception, and critics of the media would cite as a cautionary tale. This chapter isn't about the explosion itself, it's about the story we were told. NASA had long been a symbol of American progress. From the Mercury missions to Apollo 11 to Skylab, NASA represented the frontier spirit, science, exploration, and technological dominance. But by the mid-1980s, cracks were beginning to show. The shuttle program was overpromised and underperforming. Costs were ballooning. Technical setbacks were frequent. Morale was dropping, and public interest was waning. The Challenger launch was meant to turn the tide. Krista McAuliffe, the teacher-turned-astronaut, was chosen as a human face for NASA, a symbol of everyday America venturing into space. The classroom was about to meet the cosmos, and NASA was banking on it. But when the shuttle disintegrated live on national television, it wasn't just lives that were lost, it was trust, and that trust, some argue, became the most critical thing for NASA to salvage. Almost immediately, NASA shifted into damage control mode. Press briefings were tightly scripted. Updates were controlled. The phrase, "they died instantly," was repeated like a mantra. It became the emotional anchor of the story. Quick death, no suffering, no time for fear. We now know that at least some of the crew may have been conscious during the fall, but NASA never emphasized that. Instead, they leaned into heroic messaging. The astronauts slipped the surly bonds of Earth, as President Reagan famously said. It wasn't deceitful, some argue. It was necessary. But others disagreed. They saw it as manipulation, a calculated effort to guide national sentiment away from scrutiny and toward unity. The agency was fighting for survival. If the truth had been more disturbing, if engineering failures were more damning, if internal negligence was exposed too clearly, it could have meant the end of the shuttle program, and perhaps NASA itself. So they managed the narrative, they curated the tragedy. Then there's the media. For days, the media did what it does best. It reported obituaries, biographies, emotional retrospectives. The human angle took center stage. But then something strange happened. The harder questions, the ones about why the launch happened despite warnings, about who ignored the engineers, about the political pressure behind the timeline, got pushed aside. They were asked, yes, but only briefly and quietly. One of the most telling media moments occurred during the Rogers Commission hearings. Engineer Roger Boy-Jolly gave testimony that should have shocked the nation. He said he and his colleagues at Morton Thiokol had warned NASA repeatedly that the O-rings would fail in the cold. He said they were pressured by executives and NASA management to change their recommendation. He said the launch should never have happened. And what did the media do? A few outlets picked up the story. A few opinion columns raged. But it faded quickly, buried beneath the emotional haze of tributes and ceremonies. Bois-Jolly, a whistleblower in every sense, found himself isolated. His career suffered so much that he became a cautionary tale, not a national hero. And the media? It returned to covering the safer parts of the story. The loss, the heroism, the promise to do better. Another element that fueled conspiracy suspicions was the limited footage of the actual event. Yes, the explosion was shown on live TV, but the footage that followed was carefully curated. The trajectory of the crew cabin, the debris patterns, the full extent of the disaster. Much of that was never released to the public. Some believed this was for decency, to avoid traumatizing viewers. Others saw it differently. They asked, why can we see the Zapruder film of JFK's assassination, but not the detailed descent of the Challenger debris? Where are the cockpit voice recordings? Why are some internal investigation documents still classified? NASA says it's to protect the dignity of the astronauts. Others say it's to protect a lie. In many ways, the Challenger conspiracy lives in the space between official silence and digital noise. NASA won't comment on lookalikes. The media won't touch the story. And yet thousands, maybe millions, continue to ask questions. It's not that every conspiracy theorist believes the crew is alive. Some don't. But what unites them is a feeling that the full truth was never told. That narrative control replaced transparency. That trust was sacrificed for stability. And once that feeling takes root, it's hard to undo. Let's step away from emotion, from suspicion, from whispers in internet corners, and let's look at the Challenger conspiracy for what it truly is. Not with ridicule, not with mockery, but with logic, with evidence. Let's start with the Doppelganger theory, that the astronauts didn't die and are living under new identities. This is perhaps the most popular and emotionally charged theory. The faces, the names, the professions, conspiracy theorists claim they match too perfectly to be a coincidence. But do they? Let's break it down. Judith Resnick / Yale professor. Judith Resnick. Yes, there is a Judith Resnick at Yale. She's a professor of law. But her date of birth is different. Her educational background traces back to institutions that the astronaut Judith did not attend. The Yale Judith has an extensive public academic career, spanning decades, with no unexplained gaps. She has refuted the conspiracy directly, calling it offensive and absurd. The resemblance? Mild at best. It's like saying every bearded man is Abraham Lincoln. Francis Dick Scobie, Richard Scobie of Cows in Trees advertising. This one hinges entirely on a few facial features and the fact that both men have aviation-related pasts. But let's consider, there are thousands of retired Air Force pilots in the US who go on to have second careers. The age of the advertising executive doesn't match. Neither do family details. Correlation is not causation. And trust me, I totally understand why people would think these people are the same crew members who died. Human beings are hardwired to see patterns. It's how we survived in the wild, recognizing faces, threats, and connections quickly. But that evolutionary advantage has a dark side. It's what psychologists call apophenia, which is the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. Two people look alike. Must be the same person. A resume shares a few details with a dead astronaut. Must be a cover-up. NASA has ties to the military. Must be hiding something. This isn't stupidity, it's psychology. And the internet weaponizes it. But this theory relies heavily on screenshots, facial overlays, and side-by-side photos. But there's no documentary evidence, no matched fingerprints, no DNA, no forged death certificates. And that's where the theory crumbles. If these were indeed the same people, wouldn't it be far easier to confirm? We live in a world of public records, genealogy databases, and background check services. If anything this massive were true, someone somewhere would have uncovered hard proof by now. But all we have is speculation. And speculation is not the truth. Now, the second claim is that the explosion was staged. Let's look at this from a logistical standpoint. If the explosion was staged, it would have required fake debris distributed across the Atlantic Ocean, dozens, if not hundreds, of recovery personnel in on the act. Faked body remains returned to families. A staged explosion seen by thousands of spectators at Cape Canaveral, including journalists with independent camera crews. Dozens of engineers at NASA and Morton Thiokol, fabricating technical reports and post-mortem analysis. To believe this was a hoax, you'd have to believe that every single one of these individuals remained silent for nearly 40 years. No leaks, no regrets, no whistleblowers, not a single deathbed confession. This isn't just improbable, it's logistically impossible. Roger Boyd Jolly didn't even wait a week to spill the beans on NASA incompetence. So if it was staged, trust me, someone would have talked. Plus, the argument that it was staged or that NASA and the government had a motive kind of fails a basic test of incentive. What did NASA gain from Challenger's destruction? It crippled the shuttle program. It froze launches for nearly 3 years. It slashed public trust. It resulted in lawsuits, investigations, and budget cuts. This wasn't a win. It was a disaster in every sense. Even though it is hard to believe, considering the crazy things the United States government has done, and trust me, they've done a lot of shady and crazy things, but when it comes to the Challenger, it can be explained. The Challenger disaster was not caused by sabotage, shadowy agents, or secret agendas. It was a mechanical failure, cold, simple, and unforgiving. But in understanding that failure, we're forced to confront a different kind of conspiracy, not one of cloaked figures and government plots, but a systemic breakdown in communication, culture, and courage. The only problem that everyone agrees on, even Richard Feynman, was that NASA should have done better. To quote Richard Feynman, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." NASA, in its desire to maintain an image of reliability and progress, had developed a culture of silence. Concerns were downplayed, risk was normalized, warnings were brushed aside in favor of schedule and image. The Rogers Commission found that NASA's safety protocols were inconsistent. For instance, engineers assessed launch failure probabilities at 1 in 100, but NASA administrators claimed they were closer to 1 in 100,000, a number that Richard Feynman dismissed as fantasy. In the aftermath, NASA grounded the shuttle program for 32 months. The SRBs were completely redesigned, including a new joint design, improved materials, and better inspection protocols. NASA also overhauled its internal safety reporting structure. A new office, which became the Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance, was established to ensure that dissenting technical opinions could not be suppressed. Yet the scars ran deep. The Challenger disaster shattered public confidence in NASA. It exposed deep flaws in how large institutions manage risk, pressure, and truth. But it also became a turning point, a wake-up call that would save lives in the future. The real science of Challenger is not about conspiracies. It's about physics, engineering, and human failure. It's about what happens when bureaucracy overrides expertise, when appearance takes precedence over safety. The lesson isn't just for NASA, it's for every organization, every leader, every engineer, every decision maker who finds themselves at the crossroads of truth and pressure. Because in the end, as Richard Feynman said, nature cannot be fooled.